As we've proceeded through this module, there have already been multiple references to possible errors and difficulties that children might encounter. So as such, this presentation will provide little in the way of new information, but primarily serves to bring all of these ideas together for a last look, and then particularly thinking about the implications that these errors have for instruction. The most important thing that children need to truly understand are these principles of counting that we discussed earlier in the module. So the focus for the teacher should be more focused on whether children have grasped this underlying conceptual basis of counting than whether they're accurate 100% of the time. By the time children start kindergarten, they are typically well on their way in their learning journey towards grasping these principles, but nevertheless there are some outliers, and also there are children who have begun that journey but who are not applying these principles to perhaps numbers greater than 5. So these principles of counting serve as a way to frame our thinking and our assessment as we work with children and observe them counting and consider what kind of errors that we are noticing. Children do, of course, make counting errors. So when should we be concerned about these errors, and is it ever okay to ignore them? I mean, after all, even adults who clearly have already grasped one-to-one correspondence do occasionally skip count or make a counting error, which is why if you have a job that involves money, double-checking and perhaps triple-checking is a good idea. But if they have the underlying principles of counting in place, we don't have to be as anal retentive about each tiny little error that they're making. On the other hand, if our observations of them lead us to believe they do not have those principles of counting, then we need to intervene and have some concerns addressed. So what I'm recommending is that it's okay to let small errors go. You don't have to jump on every error that a student makes and bring it to their attention, assuming that they already have the principles of counting in place. That can be expected at times. If children don't have those principles of counting, if you are noticing some more consistent errors that might indicate a problem with the principles of counting, then that's something worth addressing, and that's where we're going to be spending the bulk of our time in this discussion. This quote here also illustrates that my suggestion that it's okay to ignore occasional counting errors is not just my opinion, but also emerges out of some of the documents that Common Core cited specifically in their references, and one of their foundational documents that framed their early math standards, of course, was mathematics learning in early childhood. Many of children's counting errors are tied to a correspondence problem, one-to-one correspondence, for example. And this is especially obvious in young children whose verbal count may have absolutely nothing to do with their finger-pointing actions. There are several factors that contribute to correspondence difficulties that children have, and the top 4 factors are listed here. Now, as we've seen in multiple places in this PD module, there's just no getting around the role that counting experience plays. You see huge differences in the counting skills of your learners, even from the very beginning of kindergarten. So how much of that difference can be attributed to a lack of counting experience as opposed to a lack of ability? It's best to assume that the children who are struggling are actually struggling because of a poverty of counting experience rather than a lack of ability. So brainstorm ways in which they can move from impoverished to enriched by infusing their mathematical experiences with many counting opportunities. The size of the set and the arrangement of objects are 2 other factors that influence children's success and correspondence. And so if you notice them having problems, think about whether a pathway's been scaffolded. We're going to get to that in a minute. And then finally, effort at the bottom of the list. Clearly, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that children who are careless, distracted, or putting forth low effort will obviously make more frequent errors. So now we know the most likely factors contributing to correspondence errors. How can we use that information to respond to errors? Well, this gets back to an idea that I've already introduced, which is that if the errors are occasional, but the child consistently exhibits understanding of the principles of counting, it's not really necessary to correct it. But if the errors are the result of carelessness or low effort, the response that you choose will be different than if the error is the result of a lack of understanding of counting principles. So we can take those 4 factors, those 4 top factors related to correspondence problems, and use them to structure a framing question that we can use to guide us as we think about a unique response that will be designed for the needs of the learner. So if we recognize that a particular group of our learners have had extremely limited counting experience, the top one, then naturally any instructional response that we provide will have to greatly increase the opportunities they have to count many, many times daily. And not just during math time, counting wherever it might be appropriate, counting when you line up, counting when you get back to class, counting the chairs on the way out. Lots and lots of opportunities to count every day. And you might construct some fun little counting activity books for them to do at home and fold in things that they can count around their house. Counting even things like how many times somebody says hello to them during the day. If the child is able to count accurately for small numbers, but then you see them struggling as they get to larger sets, then you're going to want to carefully consider that the size of the sets and the arrangements and how that instruction is being sequenced. Did they have a sequential learning path towards those higher expectations that you have, or did they get kind of thrust in at the deep end? If you do counting activities where everyone in the class is counting the same thing or the same quantity, then almost inevitably some of the learners will be thrown in at the deep end. Then finally, effort. This one, you can clearly see that plays a different role. To give you a little example, I have 2 daughters. They differ dramatically. It's the typical first child, second child's phenomenon. So my older daughter would, double check and triple check. Her effort was very high. And my younger one, not so much. She actually would tend to rush through things. And I came to realize that for her, this just seemed trivial. She didn't really see the point in being very careful because it didn't seem like an important or valuable kind of task. So for her, I had to think about brainstorming ways in which she could come to recognize that counting accurately is highly valuable and not just something that would be nice. So for example, we might talk about the fact that if she miscounted treats, she might not get a treat, and so that would be pretty bad. And so it is important for us to know. Having said that, I can't tell you that her personality has changed dramatically overnight, and she does have other talents that are wonderful. But nevertheless, I think there's some ways that we can actively frame our language with children whose effort is low to help them see why this is so important. And perhaps to use types of things they're counting that they'll perceive to be more authentic or relevant to themselves. Some counting errors are issues with the number word list, and we discussed those earlier, and I'm not going to go through those in this session. But the remaining errors that you see here tend to have correspondence problems associated with them. So we're going to take a look at each of these correspondence counting errors that are fairly common. So first of all, the coordination of say point. As we've discussed at multiple points in the PD module, there's a tremendous amount of coordination involved in counting accurately. And one of those acts of coordination is pointing to one object, one finger point to one object. Actually, children tend to get that pretty well. I'd be surprised if you had some your extreme outliers perhaps, but for the most part, they should be able to point to one object at a time. The real coordination issue that you can still see occasionally is the coordination of say point, that their verbal count matches their finger point. And so that's something that can exhibit difficulty and something that we need to give some thought to. Now again, if children make this type of error only occasionally, then it's probably a bit of carelessness, and so it would be good just to either let it go if it's the first time you've ever seen it, or provide a gentle reminder that checking one's count is always a good idea. And in fact, I would suggest that you send that message to children even when they have accurate counts. Otherwise, they'll think it's only necessary to check my work if I'm wrong. But if I think I'm right, then I don't need to check my work. So being able to say, have you checked your work, even when you know they're correct, can help to build some healthy counting habits of carefulness. And that relates to Mathematical Standard of Practice 6, attending to precision as well. Now, if the children have frequent issues with say-point coordination, then of course we have to think about what kind of instructional intervention that might require. We have discussed this previously, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but essentially the counting sequence has a rhythm and a regularity to it that we really want to help students get. 1.1 word, 1.1 word, 1.1 word. Now, telling them what I just said won't be very helpful, but choral counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, where each of those counts is associated with a body action. They can use the rhythm and get their body going with the rhythm as well. And so choral counting with actions, can produce that strong rhythm. And some of those actions can be a pointing action with their fingers so that you can help to build that. And you might even do that as a quick little warm-up before they actually go to count something as well. Double tagging and skipping are another type of correspondence problem. Double tagging is touching the same object more than once, and skipping is not counting the object at all. And so obviously these can both lead to inaccurate counts. Although I actually remember one time watching a child count a group of objects, and she double tagged one object and skipped another and ended up with an accurate total. So that's a prime example of how a correct answer doesn't always tell you the whole story. Assuming children have grasped the principles of counting, these kinds of tagging problems are often the result of poor organization. So if you see them doing that and you're pretty sure they have the principles of counting, it's best to support them by helping them learn to plan as they count. How will I keep myself organized? How will I know what I've already counted? How will I know what I still need to count? And being able to verbalize the strategies they're using for how they keep track. So for example, when objects are in a pile, as you see in the top image of pennies, it can be very hard to count properly because one penny's on top of another, and I might forget which pennies I've already counted and which ones I haven't. So I share dilemmas like that with the children, and I ask them to help me brainstorm a strategy that I could use to count the pennies. Now there's several correct answers here. So one child might say, well, you could put them in a line and then count them, such as you see at the bottom. And another child might say, well, you can count them one at a time and move them to a new pile as you count them. So we went to it both ways, and I might have students actually think about which way do you think would work better for you? Which way would you prefer? And I do that, it's a metacognitive technique, asking them, choose a strategy and that you feel more comfortable with. What are you going to choose to do? And the reason for that is that right now they're at a stage where I am cueing their organization. I'm prompting them, think about organization. But I don't want to keep doing that forever. I really want them to develop some decision-making skills for themselves and to recognize that they can take responsibility over how they organize their count. So discussions like that can lead eventually towards them developing some ownership of the organization techniques. Occasionally, you may see children who count well all the way up to the last item. And then as they point to that last item, maybe they say 2 counting words rather than 1. So knowing when to stop counting is also an important counting skill. Children need to realize that the same idea that we've already been applying to all the other objects, one object gets 1 number word, that also applies to the very last object. Now you might suggest, follow the suggestion there in the blue font where you discuss this whole concept with the children, and then you can do a count where you use your hand over their hand to signal them stop. And so you can do that a couple of times where they count an object. You have this discussion, then they count, and you put your hand over their hand when it's time to stop counting. And then something that's kind of interesting to try after that is where they then do it to you, where they have to stop you counting at the right point. Children love to teach the teacher. Once you've done this enough so the students know exactly how it works, you can actually team up 2 students to do it with one another. And that way they continue to reinforce that idea without it requiring your constant presence. We often encourage our children to double check their count, and that's a good idea. But sometimes children actually pick up an erroneous misconception that the second count is always correct. And it often is, because if you prompt them to double check, a lot of times they're more careful and they're checking the second time around than in the first. But it's really their carefulness that made for a more accurate count, not the fact that they just did it twice. So what you'll see as an implication of this misconception is that children will count once, then they might count a second time. Let's say the second count is different than the first. They just write the amount of the second count down. It could also be inaccurate. You and I as adults, we would probably say, uh-oh, I got two different answers. Let me count a third time and see what I get. But children often develop this misconception that the second count is always the right one. So we're going to need to chat with them about what I just mentioned, the fact, what do? We have two different answers. How do we know which one's right? We'll probably need to count a third time. That will probably be something that you want to build as a norm in your classroom. So as we engage with learners who exhibit counting errors, we have some framing questions now that we can use to help us think about the errors. For example, is it occasional or frequent? Is it related to a problem with understanding the principles of counting, or is it just a momentary glitch, or is it a carelessness issue? So we've got a variety of different questions that we can ask, and then we can also classify the kind of correspondence error and think about an activity. As we engage with a response for our learners, it's important for us to keep the really critical things in our mind. And the most critical thing isn't 100% counting accuracy all of the time. The most important thing is that they know the principles of counting, and that our response to them will foster future counting. So this is where we have to be rather careful. We want children to eagerly and frequently engage in counting. If we nag a child about their counting problems, they may avoid counting experiences because it brings anxiety because they think they're going to do it wrong. Now, in that case, it actually means that our instruction could do more harm than good. So we really have to be careful about constantly judging every little thing that a child does with counting, and recognize that counting experience is also really important, and we want them to be finding a joyful counting experience, something that they're attracted to doing. Children tend to love to count. We want to maximize that. We want to foster that love for counting and give them a lot of experience. So if you have a student who's struggling, rather than judging every little bit of their counting experience, give them lots of opportunities to count, and occasionally come in and think about, what is this that I'm noticing right now? How have you grown? Let's celebrate that together. Let's say, wow, look at how you're doing this compared to last time. And then let me give you one more suggestion for how you can make it even better the next time I watch you count. So you want to maintain that positivity, because the more they count, the better they're going to get. They also need your feedback. It's not just more is better, but you certainly don't want that feedback to be so micromanaging that they begin to avoid counting. All right, so let's take a look at some of the ideas we've been talking about and what it might look like in action. First of all, you need to set up your curriculum so that there are many opportunities for counting, not just in the math classroom, but in morning meeting and at many parts of the day related to routines that you have. These counting experiences will also need to be differentiated in some way, so that the struggling students have a lot of opportunity to work with small sets while they're still building those counting principles. They're really going to build that foundation of the counting principles when they're first working with small sets. That's where it will first develop before moving on. So while we do want to plan a learning trajectory that will lead them to counting increasingly larger quantities of objects, it's counterproductive to do that while they're still developing the conceptual basis of counting. At any given time, then their rote count will be far ahead of their actual counting of objects. So that's okay and to be encouraged. We always want the rote count up ahead. Then the size of sets that they can count will be larger than the size of sets they can create. So if somebody gives me a set of objects, I can count those. If I have some organizational systems and I know my rote count, I can count those, but maybe I'm still struggling with how to create a set that size. So those are kind of the three types of things to think about. Their rote count is further ahead than the amount of size of sets that they can accurately count, and that's ahead of the amount of size of sets that they can create. As they solidify their counting principles and they gain experience, eventually all those capacities are going to equal out. Whatever I count to, I can also not just do a rote count, I can count objects and I could create a set that size. So eventually those will equal out. But initially in these early stages of development, they're not at the same point. As they gain experience, we're going to gradually give them larger numbers and or different, more complex arrangements of objects, as we have talked about. As we do that, we need to sequence that instruction so that they are gradually getting more complex, and so that along the way they can begin to build some strategies for how to cope with that complexity. And so that's really important. We're going to validate the experiences that they have, validate the positive things they're doing, validate what they're doing well, because validation fosters perseverance. We are motivated to do the things that we feel we're getting better at or that we're doing well. It's very hard to be motivated at doing the things we're not doing well. So validation plays a really critical role in perseverance as recognized in Standard Mathematical Practice 1. Now, strategy sharing is also a very important part of this counting development in your curriculum. It's a tool for growing counting expertise. That the strategy share allows early counters to hear repeatedly and in a variety of counting situations how pivotal ideas played a role in success. For example, they hear that one number word has to be stated in the exact order while pointing to one object and that you can't skip any numbers. They hear that over and over in different ways in different contexts related to different counting tasks. They hear how their peers organized objects to keep track and how there's more than one way to do that successfully, but that they're always doing that when the objects are larger. They learn how to check their count, and they learn about the double check or triple check. They learn how to be sure that they're right and accurate, and that addresses that mathematical standard practice 6, attending to precision. So strategy sharing can be a very powerful tool for all of your learners, but certainly it provides the struggling learners a lot of opportunities to build that skill set. While occasional errors are not worth an instructional response, if the students are developing habits that hinder their accuracy, then we do need to focus their attention on more constructive habits. So reminders to slow down and to ask them about the strategy they're using to keep track are very helpful. As a means of structuring the practice, we also want to ensure that the students with different background knowledge are able to experience rigor. And we can introduce rigor into the curriculum by ensuring that students are stretched intellectually. This list represents gradually more difficult counting situations, so you can consider what type of counting arrangements might represent rigor for an individual child or some small groups in your classroom. If a child starts out only being able to count things that are in rows, plan a learning sequence that will gradually move them on to more difficult arrangements. I will tell you, though, that I tend to use larger numbers when it's a fairly easy format, and when I go to a more complex arrangement, I drop the quantity way down. That's for two reasons. First of all, it looks less intimidating to children because they've already counted many more objects than this smaller set, and so that feels more like I could possibly do this. And then also it's a cognitive load issue. Well, one thing is more complex, another thing is made easier. Now, this is also going to mean that different students in your classroom are going to be at different places in their learning and this sequence. And so, you know what that means? It's differentiation. There's going to need to be some differentiation. So you can have counting centers which focus on various aspects of sequenced arrangements or sizes of sets, and you can have students assigned to different centers. Alternatively, you can use counting collections, which we've talked about previously in the PD module. And these counting collections are brilliant for differentiation because different student pairs are counting different sets, and the set sizes and the set arrangements can be different, so that you can naturally differentiate the instruction. And for an excellent and much more thorough description of how to organize these kinds of counting collection activities in the classroom, refer to the Schwartfigger and Chan article in the reference list here in a minute. This article also provides a clear picture of how to implement the counting experiences so that they're not one size fits all, but where learners in the class are all counting at many different levels of expertise. And the article suggests even kinds of things that they could count that could stretch your more your higher ability learners, let's say. Because all learners need so much counting experience, and the struggling learners need the most counting experience of all, it's unrealistic for them to only count when you have time to monitor them. They need to count much more than you will have time to watch them. So peer counting experiences, counting centers, and counting opportunities at home are all important supplements to the normal math time. You do want to plan, though, for occasional monitoring of their counting, and of course you're going to end up needing to monitor your struggling learners more than the students who appear to have all those principles of counting already grasped. So plan for how you're going to revisit your most struggling learners more frequently to watch them counting and to be able to ask prompts that will help you ascertain how they're coming in terms of their understanding of the principles of counting. Make sure, though, that your time of monitoring them individually is positive, and that the children notices the things that they're doing well, that the children know that you are noticing the things they're doing well, and also suggest strategies designed specifically based on what you observe them doing, strategies for how they can improve their counts, and that will help to maintain that positive interaction. The Schwartfigger and Chan